wondering how that figures into the picture, because conservative government is maybe interested in revenue here, but from a carbon perspective, that seems like kind of an oversight.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think BC is having some of the same battles that we're having in Washington State about coal export. I don't know what's going on there exactly with the tar sands. I do know that they're working hard on natural gas export and production and stuff like that. You could have a debate about whether that's good or bad in terms of, well, if their argument is the natural gas is offsetting coal that would otherwise come from Australia. I don't want to get into the details on that. I will say that I tend to think that climate policy mostly is going to come from the demand side rather than the supply side. So it is, I tend to separate those kind of issues, and I like to talk about BC in the context of their carbon tax, and they're doing good work on the demand side. There are issues on the supply side with coal export and natural gas and stuff like that, but those are kind of separate issues. Did you have any hand?
Yeah, but it was actually pretty similar, whereas what are talking compared to Alberta.
Yeah.
Because that's their province that they're getting basically it's just
Yeah,
Alberta.
Alberta's doing a lot of tar sand production, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the tar sands are located. Alberta actually has they have a carbon tax. I should know more about it, but it's not an economy-wide carbon tax. It's more kind of a carbon tax specifically on the tar sands, and they try to use it to fund R&D about reducing carbon emissions with the tar sands. My joke about it used to be that Canada, it used to be that the Canadians would go around with like little Canadian flags in their backpacks and stuff, and they were traveling internationally.
Yeah.
They're like, we're not Americans, but my joke about it was that Canada is going to become the bad boy of the 21st century, and now it's like not a joke anymore.
Yeah.
Turning into a petro state. Yes, sir.
I'm not certain you haven't come out and said that per se that you favor of carbon tax, but
Oh, I haven't? Well, I will now.
okay.
I'm in favor of carbon tax.
Thank you. So my question is, it seems like it takes a very amoral position with respect to carbon emissions as just simply an economic function. But my question is whether that premise is a mistake. For example, should we have a dioxin tax, a PCB tax? If I have a good driving record, should you be able to buy some of that from me so that you can go out and do more drunk driving than you would be allowed to otherwise? Why should we have a tax on something that's immoral from the get-go? Polluting the air harms all of us. How can we tax that?
Well, I guess I tend to be kind of amoral because I'm an economist.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think about is meeting our objective, which is to reduce carbon emissions. And I think that this is the best way to reduce carbon emissions. You might have a better idea, like banning fossil fuels or something. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yes.
I've heard about the conference between British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California, and Jay Inslee said a few things about trying to figure out what they're going to do in Washington State. Is carbon1.org involved in that?
So the governor is working on, there was a meeting down in California that was in the news over the last couple of days. And basically what they said was, they came up with this agreement that said, hey, we're all going to work on carbon pricing. And Washington and Oregon are in a really interesting situation. We're in between BC, which has this carbon tax, and California, which has a cap and trade system. And both states, both Washington and Oregon, have these legislative processes that are trying to figure out how to reduce carbon emissions. The governor, I think, is more interested in the cap and trade system. That's what he seems to be talking about. Our Carbon Washington effort is looking at a revenue neutral carbon tax because we think that's a better way to get some bipartisan support, and we think it's better policy. We're going to do our best to talk to the governor about that. I mean, the challenge really is that they signed this agreement, but the agreement's not legally binding. So we have to get the legislature on board if we're going to do something. We're keen on working on ballot measures, but I don't really think the legislature is all that stuff. Why don't I take one more question, and then I'll tell some more jokes, and then Gar can talk, and then we can do questions.
Yeah, so I consider myself an economist too, but I do think it's totally wrong for economists to see themselves as amoral, and that's, I think, one of the problems. So we can talk about that later. I also think that...
I knew I was gonna get in trouble on this thing.
Okay, I also think, okay, it seems to me in your models, you're taking capitalism as a given, and I don't think we should wait till the end of capitalism to deal with climate change. We don't have that time, but I think we'll always swim upstream as long as we decide it's based on growth and profits. So saying that I'm not against the carbon tax, but I guess the question to Yoram is what this one just seems so incredibly limited. I'm asking why. For example, it seems to me a carbon tax is going to put a lot of extra costs on working class and poorer people as all, but it seems the amount going back is such a small amount compared to the amounts that say go into business. So I guess the question is, why not have something like even the Maria Cantwell, her proposal of saying all the money would come back to people, or most of it would come back to people, some would develop solar energy, and then the other part is, the revenue neutral, as opposed to saying taxes aren't good or bad. It's a question of who pays the tax, what they're used for. So rather than pushing that, why not having more money going for alternative energy, lowering tuition for education, other things too that I think could build a larger movement, rather than really trying to orient this toward the lowest common denominator, toward making business be less hostile. So I guess it's a question of why the specific form. And that's also for the VC one, but I think that's more the question about why the kind of limitation, how narrow it is.
So BCE has provided a lot of tax breaks for businesses. We're actually doing, so this is by far, the sales tax is by far the biggest chunk of what we're doing with the revenue. The sales taxes are regressive in the same way that carbon taxes are regressive, and you can have a discussion about which one's more regressive. The working families rebate is also a very effective way to reduce impacts on working, low-income working households. Politically, you could try to figure out kind of, okay, how do we put the pieces together to get a coalition that's going to be able to push this. And we're looking at a revenue neutral option because we think that that's the best way to get a political coalition together. We can talk later about other options, but that's kind of the way that we're going. All right, I want to wrap up, tell a couple more jokes, then Gar's going to talk, and then we're going to do more Q&A and stuff like this. So, oh wait, I do need to do one last thing. I need to share with you, this is my, what I call the 5 Chinas theory of the world, which I'm very proud of. And the 5 Chinas theory of the world, this is sort of, this should give you a sense of the scale of kind of what the challenge is with carbon emissions. So if you take the world population, which is 7 billion people, you can divide by 5, you get 1.4. That's the population of China. So you can divide the world into 5 chunks that are the size of China. Right? So China, India is the same size as China in terms of population. Add up everybody else in Asia, so Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, put them all together, about the same population as China. Right? The 4th China is the rich world, the OECD. So North America, Europe, Japan, a couple other random countries, add them all up, about the same population as China. Right? And then the 5th China is principally South America and Africa. Right? So you take those 5 Chinas, you look at carbon emissions in the 5 Chinas, per capita carbon emissions, you get that. Right? So at the beginning of this century, the rich world was responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions. And there are going to be, I think, 2 big stories this century. Right? One big story is going to be about growth and development in a lot of poor countries in the world. We've seen that in China, or 10% growth per year for 3 decades. We're hopefully going to see waves of development in India and Africa. And there's a lot to be happy about with that story, right? A lot of people are coming out of poverty, getting access to electricity, to transportation, to things we take for granted. The other big story, I think, of this century is going to be dealing with some of the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people on the planet trying to live the way that we live. And then keep in mind that we're going to add 2 or probably 3 more Chinas to the planet over the course of the century. And you get a sense of the scale of the challenge that we face. So now, I'll go back to telling you jokes for a couple minutes. Thanks for questioning. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this fellow came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. I will say that it's been a big year for economics comedy. I got to be in the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Yeah, thank you. Now, I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up. He was there earlier. I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this: in the world of stand-up comedy, it does not get any bigger and the PBS NewsHour. Jim Lair. I've been getting phone calls nonstop on my rotary dial telephone. It was actually pretty amazing. They interviewed 3 economists on this show. They interviewed Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. What did they ask me? I'm a motor TV fan on the PBS NewsHour. They asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. All right, now, a couple of things about this. First of all, I am not afraid of failure. All right? I'm an economist. Second, I'm a professional comedian, right? So if a joke doesn't work, you just sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks. It's basically the same thing that the Fed and the Treasury have been doing for the last couple of years. Finally, I had to admit on the PBS NewsHour that in fact I had bombed on stage. The worst show I ever did was in October 2008. Remember what the stock market and the economy was doing in October 2008? October 2008, I did a show in Colorado Springs for a group of bankers. I'm not allowed to tell you which bank it is because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. But let me just say that in order to figure out which bank it is, it wouldn't be, well, so far to go. And I totally bombed that show. Comedy is kind of a violent business, right? If you're doing well, then you're killing. If you're doing badly, then you're bombing. And I totally bombed that show and actually spent a fair amount of time afterwards sort of soul-searching, like trying to figure out where had I lost the connection with this audience of bankers in Colorado Springs in October of 2008. And I finally realized that I lost them. My opening line, and my opening line was, "Hey, how's it going?" Apparently it wasn't going very well. Why don't I stop there with the note that I really want to encourage folks here. The reason why I came to campus was to encourage folks to get involved in this Carbon Washington campaign. So I hope you'll go to our website, carbonwa.org, and sign up. We're looking for folks to, get involved in the campaign, potentially gather signatures next year. It's not impossible that we can hire some folks. So come see me afterwards. Or check out the website. And I'm going to, should I turn it over to you? Should I just turn it right over to Gar?
Yeah, just for 1 second, Gar Lipow's going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll have a half-hour question and answer. So, Jennifer, go ahead.
And let's see.
Go next.
Over that. Here we go. So this is just this one right.
Okay. So what Yoram has been saying essentially is that even though individually we may be smart, collectively we're often foolish. And so what I'm going to go on is to say when it comes to energy, we can be even more foolish than you think we are, because in a lot of cases, we overlook not just collectively, but as individuals, a chance to save energy at a profit. And the reason for that is because there are a lot of flaws in markets aside from what Yoram has been talking about. When Yoram talks about a carbon tax, basically he's been talking about the fact that we don't socially price goods. But the thing is, it's not the only kind of flaw there is. And by the way, I want to defend the carbon tax against the charge it's immoral. Here's why a carbon tax is actually a very moral thing. And that is, if we could eliminate tomorrow carbon, yes, then you'd simply pass a law that says, hey, we have the substitute, we're going to require by a year or 18 months or 2 years replacement. The fact is, if we got full will, did everything we need to do, it would take decades to eliminate it. So we're going to have carbon pollution for the next 10 or 20 years, no matter what. And under most months, even more. So if you're going to have pollution, should the polluters do it for free, or should the polluter pay? So that's not, so I just want to add, that's why a carbon tax actually is a moral thing, because we're going to have carbon pollution, because we can't avoid it without, there's no way to avoid it in a world with a population of 7 billion, except by phasing it out over a period of time. As long as it takes us to phase it out, it's actually moral for polluters to pay. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you and give you a story, an example of why we as individuals can often fail to save energy. And this is a story from early computing, business computing in the 50s in a wood pulp factory. And the management said, hey, we're going to give the workers all the expensive production information in that wood pulp factory. So what happened? The workers, because people like to accomplish things, said, hey, we're going to cut expenses. They found ways to cut expenses and improve productivity. And they did it by adding fewer chemicals and using less water, doing timing instead. And the nice thing about that is that it actually made higher quality paper. Also, although they were thinking about saving money in the 50s, no one thought about carbon emissions. But it did cut carbon emissions because it takes carbon to pump water, it takes carbon to make chemicals. So what was management's response to this? They said, hey, this is a bad thing, security. But some people, but a woman was studying this wood pulp factory and interviewed the management, and they said, hey, look, we're managers. Improving productivity and cutting costs is our job. If the workers can do this, what does anybody need us for? So you can see whose security they were thinking of. Instead, they went and said, we're going to micromanage workers, we're going to monitor them closely, and we'll be the ones to cut expenses and improve productivity. So, and as a result, you ended up with productivity rising much more slowly. You know, you had most of the time in that history of the company where it rose at industry rates. During the time the workers had access to information, it rose drastically, and expenses dropped drastically, more than normally the industry norm. After the managers cut the workers off, productivity rose at the normal rate again. So, and so this is a thing where one thing you could say is this is another type of flaw in economics called principal-agent conflict. So it is actually part of the neoclassical thing, but there's something else going on, I think, and we'll go on and see. And here's a thing that happens in, if you look economy-wide, you'll find that businesses demand much higher rates of return if they want to invest in saving energy than in cutting labor costs, sometimes as much as 5 or 6 times as much. So that means businesses bypass profitable opportunities to save energy in favor of less profitable opportunities to cut labor costs. And I could go a long spiel on this whole culture that's behind it, but the bottom line where I think it comes from is that energy, like robots, doesn't go on strike, workers do. And I think that's at the basis, I think that led to the culture that leads to this. And the culture is A, energy is your core business, and B, real men, and I'm using the masculine pronoun deliberately, real men don't save energy, they cut labor costs. And another example of profitable opportunities to save energy being lost is insulation in rented buildings where the tenant pays the utility bill. And you can see why the landlord doesn't invest. Hey, it's not their money. But the thing about with the tenant is the tenant says, hey, I can move out any time. So tenants don't invest in insulation in rented buildings very often either. And again, if you go beyond that particular split incentive, utilities can afford to spend a lot more to generate a unit of electricity than a consumer or small business can afford to save that. Again, profitable opportunities to save energy get lost where capital is expensive. So these are things where we need a carbon tax, but we need some other things besides. What other, and I'm going to go very quickly. And basically what it comes down to is that markets, one of the things they do is they discourage whole systems thinking. It's really hard to think across boundaries, across firms, about consumers and businesses at the same time in a market economy. And so that's that's a source of a lot of flaws, lack of whole system thinking. Another is inequality, because again, you have the benefits of social labor being distributed unequally, and you also have the cost. And a carbon tax helps somewhat with the cost end, but it can't tackle the benefit end. So, what can we do? Well, if we're going to really phase out emissions, we're going to have to drastically improve infrastructure. And infrastructure, historically, really large scale, has always been, you can make the sign of the cross now to hold me off, government spending, public investment, sewer lines, water lines. Sometimes that's in the form of rights-of-way, like we have with broadband, where right now we're giving away that wireless spectrum is sold at almost nothing to broadband companies. Another thing, and again, you can make the sign of the cross if you want, is old-fashioned regulation. Think of how regulation helps us, that old-fashioned kind. Seat belts required, food safety, fire safety, and in the course of work I've done over the years, I visited some countries that don't have many regulations. I visited Indonesia, I visited Gabon in Africa, and believe me, as flawed and often weak and maddening as our regulations can be, you don't want to go in a place without them, where you go in a restaurant and there are dogs in the aisle fighting. And so I'm going to go through, these are basically examples of rules that have worked, and they may not go as far as we like, but they're showing that rules, old-fashioned regulation, can save energy and often at a very low cost. Now, again, I'm emphasizing these are additions. We definitely need a carbon tax for some of the reasons Yoram has given, and maybe for some others that I won't go into, but I think a carbon tax is a very, very good idea. But the one thing we do have to remember, and something that Peter brought up, is that carbon taxes are regressive. On their own, depending on how you use them. They hit poor harder than the middle class, they hit the middle class harder than the wealthy. But it's also true that they don't have to be, because you can use the revenue in a progressive way. And just to give you some thought experiments, one thing you could do is you could actually take that money and divide it equally among everybody. I'm not saying it's the best thing to do, I'm just giving you, it was a simplified example of how you can say, how it can be progressive. And if that happens, it turns out most people get back more than they would in refunds than they would pay in a carbon tax. And that's because you're taxed according to the carbon you use. But you get a refund equal for everyone, which means you're getting part of Bill Gates' tax refund. And so part of Bill Gates' taxes. Alternatively, just to show
Can you
that.
explain that table? I don't know it's clear everybody the table was. Like what it says, like what is third quintile mean, for example?
Oh, this is the people who have the 20% lowest income. This is the next 20%. This is the third 20%. So this is the fourth, and this is the richest of all. So basically, the bottom 60% get back more. 60% of us get back more than we pay out. The middle class, and you can see the 20% between the top 20 pay a little more, but not much. And actually, it's a very small percentage of that who pay more than they get. Most of the people in here get back more than they pay. So it's really like this gets back more, this amount gets back more than they pay. And so basically it's Bill Gates and a $200,000 a year doctor who pay more than they get back, and pretty much everyone else improves. Now, another example, just a pure non-cash spending, I just wanted to find the full spectrum, is what if we took that and we spent it on residential energy efficiency? Well, one thing, almost all of us, none of us, have our houses as well insulated as they could be. Not as well insulated as they could be profitably because of that uneven access to capital strength. And so, start with, even if you could only get $1 of utility savings per $1 in efficiency upgrades, it would be progressive in much the same way as the cash flow. But the truth is, if you insulated everyone's home, most people would end up with a lot more than $1 in savings for every $1. So it would actually be more progressive than a cash refund. And again, I'm not advocating necessarily either of these. I just wanted to have two examples to show the thing. Old cash, no cash. And tax neutrality, tax things are somewhere in between. Okay, and that's the end of the, and I just hope you can get three things from this. One is that we need to do a carbon tax. We need to do some other things besides. Secondly, that a lot of our emissions come from waste due to economic flaws, and a lot of those economic flaws come from inequality and atomization, lack of connection between people in markets, where markets encourage atomization, discourage connection between people, and also encourage inequality. And so we very definitely, if we're going to do a carbon tax as a solution, we want to make sure it doesn't make inequality worse. That's really important. And that's all I wanted to do as the adult.